The Edmonton Oilers put together their most convincing win of the series so far, prevailing 3-1 over the LA Kings. And now our attention turns to putting this series away in 6 games back in Edmonton, all on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Sararis. I am one full season in as host of Locked On Oilers. This is my third NHL season with the Locked On Podcast Network, and man, I'm grateful the Oilers put that game away early. But before we get to today's jam-packed show, thank you to everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where right now, new FanDuel customers can get $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So on today's show, we are going to walk through Game 5 from a few different perspectives. We're going to start with the obvious, that what the Oilers did stylistically, what worked for them so well tonight that they weren't able to do as in earlier games. In our second segment, we're going to highlight a few players who didn't end up on the stat sheet, but had noticeable and impactful games. And then in our final segment, we're going to tie a bow, setting the table for what Game 6 is going to be and why I feel the Oilers are building and making progress. So to start out, it's not exactly a secret the Oilers have been a slow starting team this season. They have a negative first period goal differential. If you go and look in the first period this year in the regular season, the Oilers were outscored 80-69. And as games went along, they generally got better. They had a great split. They were plus 26 in the second period. They were plus 1 in the third period, and then plus 8 in overtime periods for the season. So I think that gives you a little bit of color to the idea that the Oilers are a bit of a slow starting team, that they kind of need to get going. They need to get up to game speed. And it's really a challenge because, and I was worried about this watching the game tonight, sometimes you do have to make tactical decisions and you have to plan out, for lack of a better word, how you're going to use your energy, because the Oilers came out of the gate tonight on fire. That first shift, Trent Frederick gets a really good look off the rush, and they end up overpassing it, and he misses. But you won a face-off, you got some zone time. And I think that was my biggest takeaway tonight from what the Oilers did that made the Kings uncomfortable. And it's something we've talked about extensively here on Locked On Oilers, and the everydayers have heard me say this. And if you're new, welcome. I'm glad you're along for the ride as the Oilers prevail tonight in this game 3-1 over the Kings. But I was very worried that the Oilers were going to burn themselves out. And you might say, well, Nick, they're professional athletes. They can manage their conditioning for 60 minutes. And yes, in theory, but in practice, you saw that to some degree go wrong for the Kings in the first 3 games of this series, where first 4 games of this series, you could argue, where the Kings got off to great starts, playing meticulous, tight defense, controlling the puck in the offensive zone, cycling, grinding passes high in the zone to low, low in the zone to high, and waiting for things to open up. But as games went along, their attention to detail started to wane a little bit. They got a little less crisp on that first breakout pass, and the Oilers started to bear down on them a little bit. And you got Connor and Leon going a little bit. And you got Bush going a little bit. And tonight, I give massive kudos to Janmark, to Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, and we'll talk more about guys who had good games tonight in our second segment. But I do want to mention the fact that it really felt different tonight. And some of that is a byproduct of momentum. And we talk about it all the time here, that momentum is not measurable, but you know it when you see it. And the Oilers, by virtue of the way they played in the third period and overtime of Game 4, really started to build something. And I am really, really impressed with the effort they gave tonight. And it's one thing to come out with a little bit of extra pep in your step, to really come out of the gate firing hot. It's another thing to stick with that for almost an entire game. Like we just said, the Kings played really good hockey games for 40 to 55 minutes in most of the games so far in this series up until tonight. And the Oilers were able to win 2. The Kings were able to win 2. And the Oilers saw the byproduct of their hard work tonight, where the Kings looked a little skittish. The Kings were the team that was making mistakes in their own ends. The Kings were the team that had their goalie doing all types of work to keep them in this game. You know, if Darcy Kemper has an okay night as opposed to a very good night, the score of this game is like 6-1. The Oilers had a ton of opportunities. And that brings me to my next point and what I really wanted to emphasize and highlight. The Oilers showed you in this game they're not afraid of the dirty work. They don't mind going below the goal line. They don't mind going to the net and eating a cross check. They know that if they go to the net enough and put enough pressure on the Kings, eventually you're going to get them to break down. And that was something I wrote down in my notes here after the first period was, can the Oilers stick with it? Can they sustain this level of intensity for another 2 periods? Because to that point, the Oilers hadn't really manifested actual offense. The game was 0-0 after 1 period. And it's very easy for a team to get off to a good start, not get rewarded with an actual goal, and you start to lose a little bit of confidence. And it's not an active or a conscious decision, but a team plays really well and doesn't get rewarded. And subconsciously, their bodies all simultaneous are like, man, we're working this hard and we don't have anything to show for it. And yes, again, I'll tie it back to what I had said before. Yes, they're professional athletes. Yes, the expectation is they have more willpower than us mortals. It's one of the things that makes them special. But that performance tonight, that was a special effort. When you go out there and you outscoring chance a team 61-39, you outshoot a team 36-16, out high danger chance them 20-4, out expected goals them 4.02 to 1.06. You deserve your kudos. And make no mistake about it, the Oilers just showed you that they are capable of absolutely dummying a team. And you give a lot of credit to the grittier guys on this team, to Podkolzin, to, I think Trent Frederick, I would say, had his best game as an Oiler tonight. Not a very high bar. He hasn't played a whole lot, and he's definitely not 100% comfortable yet. He definitely doesn't have as much speed burst. His hands looked a little off. He missed 2 really good chances tonight, but you give him credit for being in the right spot. Being in the right spot when the puck finds you and you get a good scoring chance. Well, ideally, you would like that puck to go in. The fact he was in open ice to receive a pass, to create a high-quality chance, that tells you he's at least blending in, that he's not missing plays. He's making plays. You give credit to Evander Kane, who is definitely not endearing himself to that LA crowd after the hit on Kempe, but he would tell you that's his job, is to play on that line, hope you get away with it. In that case, he got away with it. He ultimately converts the goal that ties this game. And that Evander Kane goal was something that just wasn't there the first few games of this series, where the Oilers were wholly dependent on Connor, Leon, and Bush going crazy. And in this game, you saw a concerted effort to get pucks deep on net and making the Kings play defense and making it Darcy Kemper play goalie. Those active decisions, forcing teams to make choices as to how they want to play things, is ultimately going to determine games, because the more pressure you're going to put on a defense or a goalie, the more likely they are to make an eventual mistake. And kudos to Calvin Pickard, who I was a little skeptical of going to for a 3rd straight game, and I can put my hand up and say I was wrong. Calvin Pickard has played very well throughout these 3 games. I wouldn't say there's any goal I really expected him to have that he didn't, but that will do it for our first segment on this edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to highlight some of the more under the radar players who had nice nights tonight, and a whole lot more on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So be sure to stick around. The NBA and NHL playoffs are here, and FanDuel is giving new customers an incredible way to get in on the action. Because right now, when you join FanDuel and place your first $5 bet, you'll get $250 in bonus bets if your bet wins. FanDuel makes betting so easy with teams or player props to get in on the fun. If you're watching basketball, threes, points, rebounds, steals, assists, or if you're watching hockey, goals, shots on goal, assists, points, saves. FanDuel has so many different ways to bet on your favorite individual player props. Plus, after the game starts, you can even combine live prop bets into a same game parlay for your chance to win. Plus, after games tip off or puck drops, you can even combine live prop bets into a same game parlay for a chance to win big. Don't miss out on the playoff fun. Head on over to FanDuel.com and claim your $250 in bonus bets today. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Victory Wednesday, playoff Victory Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. And one of my keys to the game I wrote down in my notes before the game starts. So generally, when I'm working a playoff game, my process for putting together a note sheet, organizing my thoughts, the first thing I do, I wait for the lines to come out during line rushes before the game, during warmups. I wait for those to come out and I write those down because I want to see who starts with who and if that changes over the course of the game or if it changes based on the situation. Next, I'll write down some big ideas as far as the series so far, the previous game. And the first thing I wrote down was harmonicas ? And yes, the Kings did have that group of elderly women play the harmonica again for the American national anthem. Number 2, I wrote down Calvin Pickard, 3 straight starts ? And Calvin Pickard got quite a few starts towards the end of the regular season in Stuart Skinner's absence because of that concussion. But this is somebody who hasn't gotten these types of runs of consecutive starts often. I mean, coming into this year, he had 2 career playoff games, and they were both last year in that Vancouver series. So maybe some of this is just purely running on adrenaline and meeting the moment and the environment working out. And then the third thing I wrote down in my notes as far as themes, and the last thing I wrote down before the game started, was supporting cast ? And look, it is not a fatal flaw for a team to rely on a handful of players to do a bulk of the heavy lifting. In fact, it is one of the prerequisites to be considered a serious Stanley Cup contender. You want your best players to meet the moment. You want your best, your most expensive, your most talented players to be the ones who are going to be first or second on your team in points. But one of the real differentiation points, and I talked about this a lot during the course of the regular season in comparison to the Oilers, to some of the other teams around the NHL, when you get to the second round of the playoffs, you get to a conference final, you're going to have to assume that team you're playing is going to have a comparable level of star power. I'm not saying the same quality. I'm not saying a player of equal caliber. I am saying same quality. I am saying they have 2 or 3 superstars just like you do. Of course, no team has 2 forwards as good as the Oilers. Look, if you're a Leafs fan and you want to argue Austin Matthews and Willie Nylander, maybe, but even then, I'm going to roll my eyes to some degree. These are the 2 best forwards that happen to be on the same team of any forward combination in the entire NHL. Evan Bouchard is a top 10 defenseman in terms of points. And I think objectively, I do think Evan Bouchard is a top 10 defenseman, regardless of if we're talking about just offensive defenseman or overall defenseman. Those guys have done a tremendous job in this series. Those guys have carried an outsized load through these first 3 games. But One thing I was waiting for in this series was, when is the supporting cast going to show up? When are we going to start having Trent Frederick games, Mattias Janmark games, Adam Henrique games, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins games? When is the supporting cast going to give us their signature moments? And it's really one of the telltale signs of a team that's going on a deep run, is that you are alive in the playoffs long enough for your supporting cast guys to all have one or two moments. You think about the Oilers penalty kill last year in the playoffs on the way to the Stanley Cup final, and in the Cup final with Janmark and Connor Brown contributing shorthanded goals. You think about some of those Dylan Holloway rush opportunity goals, and you've been waiting for that. You have been waiting for someone other than Connor, Leon, and Evan Bouchard to make something happen in this series. And tonight, it's not a coincidence you got the Oilers' best well-rounded effort on a night the supporting cast was the best it's been at any point in this series so far. The Oilers were outright dominant in this game. They didn't have the benefits of home ice. All of their 5 most common line permutations tonight had positive scoring chance shares. Only one of them had a negative shot on goal share, and it was 6-5. All of their lines, except for one, had a positive expected goal share, and all of their lines had a high danger chance, a positive high danger chance share. And one of the real encouraging signs from this game, and something I was genuinely worried about, especially early in this series, if you go back and listen to the episodes after game 1 and game 2, I was waiting for the Oilers' bottom 6 to really make a concerted effort to buy zone time, to just play in the offensive zone, to make the defense uncomfortable, to make Darcy Kemper uncomfortable, because that has a trickle-down effect. The more you make a team play defense, the more you make a goalie make saves, the more likely they are to eventually mess up. And we all know you're never going to spend the whole game in the other team's end, but if it's a 60-40 type split like it was tonight, it's going to be pretty hard for you to mess that up. And look, this is sports. Teams definitely mess up games where they have large swaths of control. I was very worried, frankly, how well the Oilers were playing without scoring and how much effort it took for them to get that first goal on the ledger and to make this a game. And when you're in a game like this, as a sports fan, you always get that little nervous pit in your stomach of, this is going too well, something is wrong, because it's never this easy. This is sports. It's never going to be this easy. You're never going to have your team thoroughly control a playoff game like this without something stupid happening. You're waiting for a goal to go in off of one of your own players. You're waiting for a Fugazi penalty call that gives the other team a power play, which did happen tonight, by the way. That penalty they called that led to the LA power play goal, the Kuzmenko power play goal, the redirect, that was a terrible call. That was not a trip. And look, real quick on this. I have been very anxious whenever Darnell Nurse has been on the ice. He is definitely still a bit skittish in his own end. He didn't deserve to be called for a penalty on that trip. That wasn't a trip. That player fell down and got away with it ultimately because the Oilers won, but that's the type of call you would like back. But real quick, just to shout some people out, I really liked what I saw from Evander Kane tonight. He is a mercurial figure. He is a miserable, miserable person to play against. And the Oilers needed a little bit of that moxie, a little bit of that hubris in their game. And I do think his style, I think Trent Frederick, I think Podkolzin, I think Janmark, I think Henrique, I think a lot of the guys who fill out the middle parts of this lineup around the big two, they need to have more games like this where even if they're not generating a ton of quality offense, they're in the offensive zone, they're cycling the puck, they're making the Kings block shots, they are making the Kings play defense, because that's your path to victory. We are going to take one more final break on today's show. And when we come back, we are going to tackle why I think the Oilers may have figured something out, why this series might be able to be wrapped up in 6 games, and a whole lot more on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So be sure to stick around. thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this playoff Victory Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. And now you start to feel it. Because after 2 games, after 3 games, even after 4 games, you felt like you were watching Connor Leon and Evan Bouchard try and drag along a team that had no business being here. And I was definitely too harsh on the Oilers down the stretch of the regular season, especially with all the injuries, with all the players that were either not playing at all or physically compromised to some degree. And when I do that, and I do want to explain this real quick before we get to the actual topic at hand, I am an evidence person. I want to watch the game. I want to take my notes. I want to compare that to the underlying numbers. I want to see if they match up. And if there isn't, I want to see what the disconnect is. I want to try and get an understanding of what the numbers aren't showing. But by and large, most people would tell you the Oilers didn't play good hockey in March or in early April before the playoffs started. And some of that was load management. Some of that was being a bit more tactical, worrying about the playoffs and knowing you're locked into a playoff spot. Definitely made the case on an episode right before the start of the playoffs, the idea that if any team could afford to be a bit sloppy going into the playoffs, it would be the oldest team in the NHL, which the Oilers are by average age. And for the most part, it's worked out. And tonight was really the first time it felt like, okay, not only are the Oilers playing good hockey, they're controlling the game. They are actively making the Kings uncomfortable. And it feels like they have a chance to wrap this up in less than 7 games. And look, the Kings are going to give you a kitchen sink game. It is simply how this stuff works. And I talked about this after game 3, ahead of game 4, the idea that is game 3, after the Oilers won, as improbably as they did, was game 3 your kitchen sink game, just one so you didn't get swept and you get to lose in 5? Or was that really your turning point? And for the first 45, 50 minutes of game 4, I would have told you game 3 was the Oilers' kitchen sink. It was the best they could do. It got them over the finish line. They rode the adrenaline, and great. And then you get to the third period and overtime of game 4, and the Oilers dominate. They out-control the game. They out-control the Kings in possession in the third period and overtime of that game by like 60-40, 65-35. And then not only do you dominate for 2 straight periods, you win the game in overtime, you get Leon his first career overtime playoff goal. You follow up that dominant performance in that consolidated portion of the game with an absolute thrashing. And look, 3-1 with an empty net goal does not look like a thrashing, a butt kicking, whatever terminology you want to use. The Oilers dominated this game tonight. That was the most complete effort I have seen from an Oilers team in a really long time. It has been weeks, probably months, if we're going to be honest, since the last time the Oilers played that well. And I left the game feeling like, oh, that's right. They can do that. And you think about who's contributing. You got a goal from Mattias Janmark and Evander Kane. You got really good minutes out of John Klingberg, which is a crazy sentence to me. And I wanted to shout Klingberg out in the second segment, but I kind of got carried away talking a little bit bigger picture narratives. But while he's still an adventure in his own zone, and he's always going to be, he was that when he was a great defenseman back in Dallas all those years ago, pre-COVID, pre-bubble playoff, pre-double hip surgery. John Klingberg used to be one of the best defensemen in the NHL, but he was never great in his own end. He was definitely susceptible to pressure, to turning pucks over, and he's still not the most confident skater right now. There's definitely a little bit of temerity to his game where he's not going to be as aggressive as you would probably like him to be. And some of that is him compensating for what his skate speed is now after going through all those injuries, just getting older, losing foot speed. But Klingberg was really good for them tonight. Klingberg at 5-on-5 gave them 17 minutes and 58, basically 18 minutes. And in those John Klingberg minutes, they outchanced the Kings 25-9. They outshot them 18-5. They only had the one goal, but 1-0 works. They had a 10-1 edge in high danger chances in John Klingberg's minutes tonight. Those types of numbers are strong indicators of both quality of possession and just possession at large. And when you are able to control the game for that much of the game, we said 18 minutes. Okay. If you controlled 18 minutes of the game when John Klingberg was out there, that means we take that out of the 60 minutes of the overall game. So we're down to 42 minutes of the game. We need to try and win that. And then because we're not playing Klingberg with McDavid and Draisaitl all that much, we can chalk another 20 minutes or so to Connor and Leon. Okay. Then what do we do in our final 18 to 20-ish minutes that we have to play with here? Who's going to fill out those minutes? And the Oilers, to their credit, came out with a game plan and a style of play that was highly effective. They were not as reliant on rush chances, other than on the zone entries on the power play, not a whole lot of drop passes. And then the real differentiation point for me in this game was just how good the Oilers were in transition defensively, because they have been getting gouged by Adrian Kempe, by Kevin Fiala, by Quentin Byfield, by the fast skaters on the Kings attacking wide and then using that width to funnel whatever two defensemen are on the ice directly into the net front. And at that point, you're vulnerable to the big cross-seam pass, which the Kings have hit a couple times in this series for one-timers to score. So you're taking away those rush chances and you're forcing the Kings to really grind it out for offense. And you're doing that in a game where you're going to have 60, 70% of the possession. That's a really tantalizing formula because you're not playing a lot of defense. What little defense you are playing is not off of the rush. So there's going to be fewer opportunities for that big cross-seam pass. There's going to be fewer opportunities to create dangerous offense because you've done such a good job through the neutral zone of slowing them down, of giving your back checkers time to get back on defense, to set up, to block shots. Speaking of blocking shots, Nuge's empty net goal happens because he blocks a shot. And that last 2 minutes there with the empty net, I was definitely a little bit nervous. I was definitely sitting on my hands, and I'll give myself credit. I wasn't standing up with my arms crossed looking at the TV like a dad with National Treasure on TNT in the living room on a rainy Saturday. But now your attention transitions to Game 6. Your attention transitions to how can the Oilers put this series away, and how can they withstand the push that the Kings are absolutely going to give them, because in the playoffs, facing that specter of elimination, it coaxes something out of you. And you saw it tonight in Carolina, the double overtime game between the Devils and Hurricanes. The Devils didn't have a whole lot. They're injured beyond belief, missing so many of their players. They were able to limit to 2 overtimes. You look at the Senators, who were down 3-1. They went out there and beat Toronto. They took care of business. They showed you an air of desperation. The Kings will have that air of desperation. That makes it incumbent upon the Oilers to use the energy they're going to have being on home ice, to take advantage of the knowledge they've gained over the last 3 games as far as what they need to do offensively to control the game, to put pressure on the Kings. Because you saw the Kings trying to push back in this game to mount some offense, and it just wasn't coming easily to them. So you have the recipe. Now it's a matter of going out there and executing it again. But that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank you so much to everyone who made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. If you're new here, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, or if you're watching over on YouTube. This is the fun part of the season. The playoffs, there is nothing like it. And if you're itching for more hockey content, go check out the Locked On NHL feed for Locked On NHL Game Night, which goes live after the last game of the night goes final, breaking down the action. And then the next day, Locked On NHL covering the big stories, the narratives, the storylines going into the next day's games. I will talk to you guys tomorrow ahead of game number 6 of the first round series between the Oilers and the Kings. Till then, let's go Oilers.